Good evening. Thank you for your patience. I'm Jean McCormick, and I have the privilege of being the president of the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate. So we're very happy to have you all here with us tonight and welcome you to the Library of Congress this is our second oral history project. We call it the first since the launch. This tremendous resource, which Vicki will tell you a little bit more about, but one that is going to be a wonderful historical reflection on an era. People live through an era and they rarely get the opportunity to sit down and say, let me think back on that. And many people, in addition to Senator Kennedy, did this. So we have 2 programs a year, and we choose a theme or a topic that many people have talked about. This one, Peace and Reconciliation in Northern Ireland, was close to the Senator's heart, and we thought it should be the second of the series that we did. We only opened the Institute a year ago, and Senator Kennedy was very clear that he didn't want a place that was a monument to him, but was about the 2,000 approximately men and women who have served in the Senate. It has at its center an exact replica of the United States Senate chamber. And I tell you, I smile every day when I have 8-year-olds and 88-year-olds sitting in Senate seats and passing legislation with some very thoughtful comments that are set by the stage of the young people who play the roles of the senators to help them get established. It was the senator's hope that people would be reanimated and re-energized about civic engagement. He thought it was very important that people understand that the leadership of the future for public service had to come from this generation. It's my privilege. I retired after 20 years as a college president and didn't expect to be doing this, but every day I'm re-energized myself by what the possibilities are. So when you're in Boston, do come and visit. But tonight we bring the program here to you. We have an engaging topic. We have a really wonderful panel who can both talk about their experience and some of the story behind the story, which we always like to hear. We'll be looking backwards in a reflective way, but it's hard to do that on this topic without looking forward as well and thinking about what still is to be accomplished. So I've already told them that I'm not going to give elaborate introductions of each of our panelists because it's more important for you to hear them in their own words. So to start the program, we are really blessed to be welcomed to the podium Ireland's 17th ambassador and the first woman ambassador, Her Excellency Ann Anderson.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. McCormack, for that introduction, Senator Mitchell, Mrs. Vicki Kennedy, distinguished panelists, all the distinguished guests. I really am genuinely, immensely happy to be here this evening. Now, it's not an easy night for me because the Taoiseach, my Prime Minister, comes to town tomorrow, and usually ambassadors are working very hard the night before their Prime Minister comes to town. But I have to say he's on a Kennedy-related visit because he comes to the Kennedy Centre tomorrow to open the Ireland 100 Festival, which is the centrepiece of our celebrations abroad of our 1916 centenary. And it says a lot that in the worldwide celebrations, when we wanted a centrepiece, we felt it had to be in the Kennedy Centre, this living memorial, of course, to President Kennedy. But there are reasons why I absolutely wanted to be here this evening, and just let me very quickly share a few of them. Firstly, of course, it's our tremendous sense of gratitude to and respect for Senator Edward Kennedy. He was, of course, as we all know, the lion of the Senate, but he was a lion in terms of US-Irish relationships, I think. We all know that as well. He was there always to understand and to explain and to advocate the Irish interest and, of course, to work for peace and reconciliation in Northern Ireland. And I was very, very proud to be there in March of last year at the opening of the Institute. It was such a moving moment, and I loved seeing the recreation of the study. It has an Irish flag, an Irish signpost, and many other signs of his affection for Ireland. The second reason is that we are tremendous supporters of and believers in the mission of the Institute. In addition, of course, to the emphasis on the Senate, there is that immensely important emphasis on encouraging participatory democracy and invigorating civil discourse. Now, that's important, obviously, in all our countries at all times. I'm a diplomat and will choose my words carefully, but in the midst of where we are in this presidential election campaign in this country, with so many people expressing concerns about the impoverishment of civil discourse and the risks to civil discourse, never has it seemed more relevant and more important to have an institute with the mandate that it has. Thirdly, of course, as we know, this event is situated in the context of the Oral History Project. Such a treasure trove of 280 or so interviews, including interviews with colleagues from my own department. And oral history, it's just, it's so important. It's vivid, it's contemporary, it's human, it's multifaceted, and it really enriches our sense of history and our understanding of history. And the fourth reason, of course, is that tonight is about Northern Ireland. And we have here Senator Mitchell and the panellists, all of whom, Senator Mitchell particularly, but all of the panellists played their part in shaping the history and events in Northern Ireland. And as Jean said, will help us to understand not just how we got where we are, but help us think about how we go forward. And just now, in the aftermath of the elections in Northern Ireland, as we think about how to go forward, and how to meet the challenges ahead, it's so important that we have the enrichment of their insights and wisdom this evening. So it's going to be a great evening. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you for including me.
We're very fortunate to have with us tonight the first Secretary of the Northern Ireland Bureau, Stewart Matthews. Would you join us and have a few words yourself?
Thank you, Dr. McCormick, for your warm introduction. Mrs. Kennedy, Senator Mitchell, Ambassador Anderson, and indeed the distinguished panellists and distinguished guests. It's a great honour for me to be here this evening to represent the Northern Ireland Executive, especially in the presence of so many who have done so much to support the peace process in Northern Ireland over many, many years, and particularly to these sitting in the front row who have done so much. Thank you. I've been in Washington just over 3 years, and I continue to be humbled by the number of people who take such an interest in our little corner in the world and have done so much to help us to progress. Tonight I want to pay tribute to the late Senator, who most definitely was in it for the long game when it came to Northern Ireland. In our office, we have a wonderful photograph of the ceremony when devolution was restored at Stormont in May 2007 after a 5-year break. And rightly sitting in pride of place in the front row are Senator Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy. If he were still with us today, I hope he would be pleased that we've just completed new elections to the Northern Ireland Assembly that marked the completion of 2 full complete mandates of the Assembly since that photograph was taken, without any suspensions or any breaks. A significant achievement. And it was an election cycle not dominated, as they once were, totally by the constitutional question or orange versus green politics, but by real politics, by the economy, by education, by social welfare, by healthcare. Very similar issues that feature highly in politics here in the US and indeed the world over. This, I hope, is also welcome news to our keynote speaker this evening, Senator Mitchell. Senator, I particularly enjoyed the documentary you did in 2012 when you took your son Andrew, then 14, to see the Assembly working normally on everyday, rather prosaic matters. And I believe this trend in normalising politics has continued and is indeed very welcome. The parties are currently negotiating a new programme for government for the next mandate. And at the centre of that will be rebuilding and rebalancing the economy as it has been over the last few years. And again, as well as all the political support we've enjoyed from the US, there's been so much support on the economic front. There's 175 US businesses operating across Northern Ireland, employing over 24,000 people. The quality of our workforce is world renowned, but like any good relationship, the dynamic is now two ways. Cutting-edge Indigenous Northern Ireland firms are making growing inroads here in the US, with around $1.5 billion worth of goods purchased here in the last year. And that marked a big increase, a staggering increase of 79% from the previous year. And the relationship between our part of the world and the US goes back a long way. Next week, on May 27th, the US Consulate in Belfast will celebrate its 220th anniversary. It was President George Washington that signed the order that established it in 1796, the second oldest continuous running consulate in the world, US consulate in the world. But as we've said tonight, it's not all about the past. We know it's about looking to the future. We know that the US will continue to walk with us as we work through some of the post-conflict issues that do still need to be addressed. And I know I, for one, can look forward to, with confidence, to my two children, born since that devolution day in 2007, growing up in a Northern Ireland that looks a lot different and a lot brighter than the one that I grew up in the 70s and 80s. So I look forward to a wonderful evening, and I thank you all for being here. Thank you.
At the Institute, we make a point of not saying what would Senator Kennedy say, although we have great imitations of some of his more roaring speeches by some of the staff. But we would not be there, and we do look often to Reggie Kennedy to tell us, are we on the right track for the spirit and the values and the things that the Senator cared about. So I'm pleased to introduce the founding president of our Board of Trustees, Reggie Kennedy.
Thanks so much, Jean, and thank you for your leadership at the Institute. Ambassador Anderson, First Secretary Matthews, thank you so much for joining us. We're really grateful for your presence and appreciate so much your words. We are so delighted to have such a stellar panel to participate in our discussion of peace and reconciliation of Northern Ireland. Senator Mitchell, whom I'll introduce in just a few minutes, Ambassador Soderberg, Niall O'Dowd, and we'll be joined a little later after votes, which all of us in Washington totally understand, by Congressman Neal and Congressman King. Our moderator, Kelly O'Donnell, will be with us. We know we'll have a very lively and interesting discussion. As Jean mentioned, this is our second conversation as part of the Edward M. Kennedy Oral History Project, which is comprised of 280 candid interviews with elected officials both from this nation and abroad, family members, friends, and those who have worked in the trenches on the most important issues facing our nation and the world. And there were 29 interviews with Teddy himself. The value of this material to historians and for the education of future generations is really unparalleled. It is truly Teddy's gift to the ages. We discuss this evening issues surrounding Northern Ireland, the conflict there, the role the United States played in helping to resolve the Troubles, and of course, the role that Ted Kennedy himself played. At least a dozen oral history interviews were specifically focused on Irish issues, and many others touched on them. Our discussion could not be timelier, because we also mark the centenary of the Easter Rising, as Ambassador Anderson said, the first bloody step in a several-year process that led to the independence of the Republic of Ireland. But as we all know, Even after that independence, the North and South remained divided, and there was unrest. And for the Irish diaspora here in the United States, there remained deep concern for what was happening on the Emerald Isle. Shortly after the Troubles began in the 1960s, my husband began to immerse himself more deeply in the issue and focus in earnest on the possibilities for peace and reconciliation in Northern Ireland. Teddy's sister, Ambassador Jean Kennedy Smith, who was unable to be with us in person this evening, also believed in the possibilities of peace and reconciliation in Northern Ireland. As the oral histories make clear, Jean played a key role in bringing people together. I encourage you after the program to read the transcripts that are on our website at emkinstitute.org. I believe that getting an intimate inside look at the behind-the-scenes work that led to the peace process is one of the most fascinating insights gained from the Edward M. Kennedy Oral History Project. And one of the indispensable figures in that process is our next speaker. To look at his career is to look at the career of a public servant and a leader, a U.S. attorney, a federal judge, a United States senator, a majority leader in the United States Senate, selected 6 years in a row by a bipartisan group of senators as the most respected senator in that august body. For most people, that would be more than a lifetime of achievement, but not for our speaker. After he retired from the Senate, he answered the call to serve as chairman of the International Commission on Disarmament in Northern Ireland, and later as chairman of the subsequent peace negotiations that culminated in the historic Good Friday Agreement. He's been awarded the Philadelphia Liberty Medal, the Truman Institute Peace Prize, the German Peace Prize, the United Nations UNESCO Peace Prize, and the Presidential Medal of Freedom. I honestly could keep going, but I think you get the message. He's shown by witness of his own life that public service is a noble profession, and that one man can indeed make a difference. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming him now, my friend, Teddy's friend, a true American patriot, Senator George Mitchell.
Well, thank you very much, Vicki, for that really overly generous introduction. Ambassador Anderson and colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for being here. Thank you for your warm reception. We join in a recollection of two great events, Northern Ireland and Ted Kennedy. Ted was a force of nature, as they say, a truly great public servant and a wonderful, wonderful colleague and friend to me during my entire time in the Senate. I want to begin with a few stories because Ted, while he's best known for his tremendous legislative record, his contribution to the advancement of our society, in particular to the concepts of equal justice and equal opportunity for all Americans. Ted was also a great storyteller, joke teller, a lover of humor, and I can't tell some of the jokes he told, but I do want to tell a couple. The first is how I met Ted Kennedy. I was serving as a federal judge in Maine when Senator Muskie was appointed Secretary of State, creating a vacancy in the Senate. The governor of Maine, a good Irish-American man named Joe Brennan, announced that since it was in the middle of the year, the Senate was in session, he didn't want the Senate to be underrepresented, so he was going to quickly make a decision, and he scheduled a press conference just a few days later on a Monday noon to announce his decision. There was a lot of speculation. My name was not included among them because I'd been appointed a federal judge just the year before. On the Sunday evening, before the governor's press conference, I went to bed early. We go to bed early in Maine, especially on Sunday nights, wondering, like everyone else in Maine, what the governor was going to do. About 11 o'clock, the phone rang. It was the governor. He said, "I'd like you to come down to the state capitol tomorrow at noon so I can announce that I'm going to appoint you to the Senate." I said, "Governor, it's really a big surprise, a big decision. I've been a federal judge for less than a year. I got to think about it." He said, "I'll give you 1 hour." When I protested, he insisted. So when we hung up, I immediately called my family. I have 3 older brothers. I grew up in a very small town in Maine. My 3 brothers were very famous athletes, very prominent, not just in our community, but around New England. Then I came along, and I was not as good an athlete as my brothers. So very early in my life, I became known as Johnny Mitchell's kid brother, the one who isn't any good. As you might expect, I developed a massive inferiority complex and a highly competitive attitude toward my brothers. So after I hung up from the governor, I called my brothers ostensibly to seek their advice. But I confess there was a note of triumphalism. I put it to them this way: "Guys, the governor has just called. He wants to appoint me to the U.S. Senate. What do you think about that?" Their reactions were predictably negative. My brother Johnny said, "You should stay where you are because everybody knows you're a born loser. You couldn't possibly win a statewide election." My older brother, who fancies himself an intellectual, likes to use the Socratic method of dialogue by questions. He said, "Let's first ask, aren't the people of Maine entitled to having a qualified person representing them in the Senate? And secondly, isn't it obvious that you're not one of them?" I hung up. I called the governor. I said, "Governor, I don't need an hour. I've already received all the reassurance I need of my ability to serve in this job." So I went to the state capitol. The next day, the governor announced it. I flew to Washington. The swearing-in was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. But when I landed at National Airport, I had nothing to do, and just literally on a whim, I said to the cab driver, "Take me to the Senate side of the Capitol." I thought I'd come up, maybe find the majority leader, introduce myself. I get up to the Senate. I was taken in. The Senate was in session debating a bill. And I went taken down to the well of the Senate to meet the then Majority Leader Robert Byrd. He had a vague idea who I was. He was very busy. He said, "Okay, young man, we'll swear you in right now." I protested because I'd flown down thinking on the plane, I wonder if all 3 networks would be covering it live. I knew for sure that all the major newspapers were holding a special edition, and I didn't want to upset that schedule. But Senator Byrd said to me, he said, "Son," I said, "we're going to swear you in now, so we're going to swear you in now." And I said, "Yes, sir." So I was sworn in. They interrupted a debate, swore me in, and almost immediately thereafter, the Senate resumed session, and a vote occurred. For those of you interested in political trivia, and nobody would be here if they weren't interested in political trivia, I hold the all-time record in American history for having cast a vote the shortest time after entering the Senate, 2 minutes. That was the first of many informed judgments I made in behalf of you and all the other American people. And then Senator Byrd said to me, "Well, you should hang around," he said, "because there's going to be a filibuster tonight, and you can see how it works." So, not knowing any better, because I knew nothing about what was happening, I took my seat, number 100 way in the back corner, and the whole Senate emptied out. And I was there alone, wondering what was going to happen, and after a while another senator came in. He got the attention of the presiding officer. He said, I'd like to say a few words, and he spoke for 6 hours. I was the only other senator there, so he spoke to me for 6 hours. After about 3 or 4, I realized I wasn't learning anything. I wanted to go about doing the nation's business. I had thoughts of leaving. He must have sensed it because he walked over and stood in front of me and directed his remarks toward me. After 6 hours, there was a quorum call, how they keep it going. And many of you here know about the Senate. You know, when a vote occurs, the lights flash and the bells ring. And that's what happened. And the other 98 senators poured in. They cast votes just signifying their presence, really. And then the filibuster resumed. Another guy came on. The others left. And this guy spoke to me for 6 hours. So I stayed up all night, sitting in the Senate, serving as an audience. And finally, I was very tired, hungry. I went over to a clerk standing by the side door. And I asked him, I said, look, I said, I'm sorry to bother you. I said, I'm new here. He said, Senator, that's obvious to everyone. I said, I'm here thinking I'm serving the nation, and I'm wondering all these other senators, they're not here. Where are they? What do they do? Where do they go? He said, I'll do better than tell you. I'll show you. So he took me around to a room behind the Senate chamber. There's a big, looks like a hallway. It's called the reading room, and then there's like a library in the back of it. It's converted into a place where senators sleep during the filibusters. They bring in these narrow folding cots of the type you see in emergency shelters. And he took me into this room, and there lying there was a whole bunch of mostly old white guys snoring away. He said, there's a cot in the middle. There are no aisles. He said, you better grab that one. So I had to climb over other senators to get there. And who was the first person I had to climb over? Ted Kennedy. And of course, you know, Vicki, you know, he was not a slight fellow. And so getting over him, to me, at the time, felt like I was climbing Mount Everest without any equipment. So I used all the athletic skill that my brother said I don't have. I got over him without disturbing him. And before I was able to congratulate myself, I looked on the next cot, lying on his back, really snoring away, was Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina. I hadn't been there long, but I was well aware of Senator Helms' reputation as a staunch defender of heterosexual rights. So I was really worried, climbing over him, imagining the controversy that had been if I lost my balance and fell on top of him right there in the presence of a lot of famous people. So I made it across without disturbing either of them. I got on this cot, and I started to think of what a huge mistake I'd made. I'd been a federal judge, a distinguished, dignified person with a robe. People stood up when I came in the room. They sat down when I told them to sit down. They got up when I left the room. Now here I was, just one more of these guys snoring away overnight, and I wallowed in self-pity. And then I rolled over on this cot, and I looked just inches away into the face of the senator on the next cot. It was John Warner of Virginia. At that time, he was married to Elizabeth Taylor. And I thought to myself, who am I to feel sorry for myself? Here's a guy who could be home, legally in bed with Elizabeth Taylor, and he's spending the night with me. So I realized then that no matter how bad off you've got it, there's always some guy's got it worse. And I resolved not to feel sorry for myself. So the next time the bells rang and the lights flashed, it was by then early morning, I made it a point when I get up to walk around, stand by the door, so that when Teddy got himself up and assembled, I introduced myself to him right there in the chamber where we all slept. And that was my first meeting with Ted Kennedy. Unforgettable for me. I'm sure he didn't remember it for a very long time. I do want to tell one other story, which is a Teddy favorite. Later, of course, we got to be very good friends, and I made many appearances in Boston at various political events, often with Ted, often with John Kerry, and sometimes with the two of them together. And I told this story, which is partially true, that they got a kick out of, Teddy got a kick out of. So when I would go, for reasons you'll understand in a moment, when I would go to Boston, Teddy would say to me, "You're going to tell that story about the big dig tonight, aren't you?" And I said, "Well, I don't know." And John Kerry would phone and say, "You're not going to tell that damn story about the big dig." He said, "We've heard enough of that. We're sick of it." Teddy would say, "No, no, no, you tell the story, I insist." So here's the story I would tell about Teddy and John Kerry and the big dig. Teddy in the Senate and Tip O'Neill in the House got included in the authorization on one of what we call the highway bill, now the transportation bill, for the big dig in Boston, the huge effort to reduce traffic by building an underground network of roads under the city. Very controversial, very expensive. Before they started, there was a change in the administration in Massachusetts, and the newly elected governor didn't want the project to be retained. So he got in touch with President Reagan and asked him to, in his budget, withdraw support authorization for the big dig. So Teddy and John and Massachusetts House members all were upset, and so they were deeply concerned and wanted to fight hard to make sure the effort to remove the funding authorization did not succeed. Now, it turned out that neither Ted nor John Kerry were on the authorizing committee, but I was, as was John Chafee, a Republican senator from Rhode Island, a terrific guy, very good friends of Ted's and mine. So when we got to the portion of the authorization bill that included the big dig and the highway stuff, Teddy would call me up at 7 o'clock in the morning, and he'd say, "Now, you're going to fight like hell today for the big dig, right? Tell me what you're going to do." And I'd say, "Well, you know, we'll do our best." And then at 7:15, John Kerry would call, and he'd sort of repeat the thing. So Chafee and I would go in at 9 o'clock, and we'd start on a bill. And about that time, Teddy and John Kerry would put out a press release of how much they're doing that day to save the big dig in the authorizing bill. And Chafee and I would work all day trying to beg people to keep it in, and then we come out and read the press releases about how much Teddy and John had done that day. And this went on for several months. We finally were able to keep it in the bill, and the project stayed, and Teddy and John had many, many press conferences about it. Then there developed a question about what name would go on the tunnel under Boston Harbor. That was a major part of the Big Dig project. So I went to see Ted, and I said to him, "Teddy, I think the harbor tunnel should be named after me." He said, "You?" He said, "Oh, that's ridiculous." He said, you're not even from Massachusetts." He said, "You're from Maine." I said, "Yeah." I said, "But I'm the one who did all the work." He said, "What's that got to do with it?" And I said, "Well, look, Ted," I said, "I don't think you got a choice, because here's the reality. You can't take 10 steps in Boston without running into something named after Kennedy. You can't drive to any part of Massachusetts without crossing Kennedy bridges and driving on Kennedy highways." I said, "But you search this state, and you can't find a thing named after John Kerry." And John Kerry, who then wasn't as famous as he is now, he hadn't been nominated for president, hadn't been Secretary of State, John Kerry's going to insist that this tunnel be named after him. And so really, Teddy, you got two choices. I said, "It's either the Kerry Tunnel or the Mitchell Tunnel." Teddy looked out the window. He thought, "The Mitchell Tunnel." He said, "It sounds okay to me." So then I went to see John Kerry. And I basically told the same story. And I said, "John," I said, "the Kennedys got everything named after them in Massachusetts. You think they're going to let you get a prize like this?" I said, "I've searched the state of Massachusetts, and the only thing I can find named after you is a car wash in Chicopee." There's nothing else. They're never going to give this thing up. So I said, John, you got two choices. I said, it's either going to be the Kennedy Tunnel or the Mitchell Tunnel. And he looked out the window and he said, the Mitchell Tunnel, that sounds good to me. So I had the support of both of them. But others didn't agree, and they came up with some guy named Ted Williams, who really did deserve it. But that's how the Harbor Tunnel was built and named, for Ted Williams in behalf of Ted Kennedy. So let me now say a few serious words. Ted was indisputably one of the great legislators in our nation's entire history. He served for about 47 years in the Senate. It really was his home. It was the place where he found himself most comfortable and most effective, and he truly did love the Senate. And he made major contributions to it. I will speak of Northern Ireland in a moment, but I have to say that no single person in our history had a greater commitment to the ideal of equal justice and equal opportunity for all Americans, regardless of their background or status. And in particular, he stood for the principle that health care for Americans is not a privilege, not to be rationed based upon status or wealth, but something that should be available in good quality to every single person in our society. And he fought for his entire life for that principle and was successful in making many steps possible moving toward that objective. He and I and Chafee for a time worked closely together in 1993 and 94 trying to advance President Clinton's health care initiative. We got to August and I canceled the Senate recess and I kept the Senate in session to try to move the bill forward over overwhelming opposition. When it became clear, to me at least, and to President Clinton, that the bill could not succeed, I made the decision, controversial, difficult for me, to take the bill down and to end debate on it. We had a caucus of Democratic senators, and many of them expressed their views. Many of them wanted the bill taken down because it was obvious that it could not be enacted. Ted resisted to the very end. He so deeply and passionately felt the importance that every American child have good quality care and that every American citizen have the same opportunity for a healthy and long life, that he didn't want to give up, even in the face of those odds. We did take the bill down, and I'm sure Vicki will agree to me that it was a tremendous monument to Ted Kennedy when the Affordable Care Act was finally enacted. Imperfect, as are all human efforts, and certainly all legislation that gets through the Senate, particularly legislation that is difficult, controversial, where many compromises have to be made. And it will be decades before it sorts itself out and reaches the equilibrium that enables it to do the most good at the least cost. But every time I read a story about the Affordable Care Act, about Obamacare, I think first and foremost about Ted Kennedy, who devoted a great deal of his life, his energy, and his effort to making that possible. And I believe in a very real way he did make it possible, because the incremental advances for which Ted was responsible helped to inform the American people of the principles that he represented, of the importance to it in our society. He won many, many victories in the Senate. He is rightfully acclaimed for a long roster of achievements. But in my mind, the fact that we couldn't get it done when we had it on the Senate floor, and that it finally did get done with Ted's effort and insistence, because he didn't give up. The day after I took the bill down, Ted started thinking about what can we do next? What smaller step can we take that will make it possible? To me, that demonstrated, that illustrated, it represented what Ted Kennedy was as a human being, as a leader, as a legislator. He was also, and I'll get now briefly to Northern Ireland, he was crucial to my involvement in the process. My father's parents were born in Ireland. They emigrated to the United States in the 1890s. We know little about them because my father was born in Boston but never knew his parents and was raised in a Catholic orphanage there. After several years, his mother had died early. His father couldn't care for the children. After several years, then my father was adopted by an elderly couple who ended up in a small town in Maine. They were not Irish. And so my father, who was uneducated, who worked as a laborer and as a janitor, and my mother, who was an immigrant herself, who could not read or write, knew little about history or current affairs and knew nothing about Ireland. I never once heard my father say the word. One day in the Senate, Ted asked if I would meet with him and Chris Dodd. And I went to Ted's hideaway in the Capitol, a small office just off the Senate floor, and spent about an hour with him as he spoke to me, described to me the circumstances that then existed, the nascent efforts to achieve ceasefires and to establish a sense of negotiation, and asked if I would join with he and Chris and Pat Moynihan in taking some steps that would help to move it forward. I did so not out of any deep knowledge of Northern Ireland or Ireland. I had at that time never been to either, but out of great respect for Ted and for the sense that he conveyed that this was the right thing to do. Later, when President Clinton asked me to go to Northern Ireland, I accepted, and I spent several years there learning about the issues, meeting and understanding the motives and platforms of the various political parties and political figures. And through it all, Ted was to me a mentor and someone who I knew was passionate about moving it forward. And looking back on it, he did make a tremendous contribution because he influenced members of the Senate, as he did me, and the American public in two very important respects. He got those who favor the side of nationalism to understand that the only real way forward was through peaceful negotiation. He was very much influenced by John Hume, as I was, and other members of Congress who got to meet and to know John, and by other Northern Ireland nationalist leaders. And Teddy also instinctively understood, he was so good at grasping the intention and attitudes of the other side, that it was equally critically important to make unionists feel at home in this country, to have them have the opportunity to come here and see that the United States was not monolithic in its views on the issue. Indeed, most Americans didn't have much grasp of it. And Ted made it a point to personally acquaint himself with some unionist leaders, to invite them here. And I always think of it as a culminating event, although it was not Ted exclusively who did it, that after we got the agreement, the JFK Center, and Teddy attended the session, brought over political leaders from Northern Ireland, from both communities, and awarded them the JFK Profile and Courage Award, which meant a great deal to them, and which indicated that after not just decades, but truly centuries of hostility and conflict, of very little in the way of communication, understanding, or empathy for another position, that it was the master legislator, Ted Kennedy, the man who, although he was widely viewed as a partisan figure, was in the Senate regarded as one of the most effective bipartisan legislators in history, because he could listen, he had empathy for other positions, he was able to quickly discern and identify potential areas of common ground, and with his tremendous, friendly, vivacious, and irresistible attitude and sense of humor and force of his personality to persuade people to come together. He'd done it so often in the legislative process, and he really was hugely instrumental in doing it in Northern Ireland. And while I've always said and believed that the true heroes of Northern Ireland were the political leaders of Northern Ireland on both sides, who after centuries of conflict, of lifetimes of their being deeply involved in conflict, violent and political, rose to the occasion at a critical moment in their society's history, at enormous risk to themselves and their careers, and took a step of courage that has made possible the peace that has now held for 18 years, and we hope will hold for many, many more. And my fondest wish is that everybody here and others involved, whenever they hear about Northern Ireland, whenever they think about Northern Ireland, whenever they go to Northern Ireland, will keep in mind one of the truly great architects of that process, as well as so much that he did in this country, and that was Ted Kennedy. I was greatly honored to serve with him in the Senate, and very proud personally to have been his friend. So I'm really thrilled at the opportunity to be here today. Thank you, Vicki, so much for making it possible. I look forward to participating with the panel in the discussion, and I thank all of you for coming to honor one of the great men in modern America and perhaps all of American history, our friend and great Senator, Ted Kennedy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator. Could I invite our other panelists to come up and join the Senator? Nancy Soderberg, who's the former U.S. Ambassador at the United Nations and has had many prestigious positions, but was a foreign policy advisor to Senator Kennedy. Niall O'Dowd, founder and CEO of Irish Central. And Neil, you'll wove into the story on the panel many other roles that you've played. I did see Congressman Neal. And did I also see Congressman King? Yes, sure. Great. Two who continue to be paying attention to all things Irish in the Congress. And they are joined by NBC correspondent Kelly O'Donnell, who couldn't be more Irish, Kelly and O'Donnell, who is going to facilitate a discussion on the panel. We are enormously grateful for all of you being able to be here with us today.
Well, it's really my privilege. Not only does the name sound Irish, but I am the granddaughter of Irish immigrants, and whenever anything associated with Senator Kennedy and Vicky would ask, of course, the answer is yes. How soon and how often can I be there? So it is a privilege for me to be here. I care about these issues, as I have also had the privilege of covering the Senate, covering Senator Kennedy when he was with us, and covering some of these issues in real time. And I also have the personal experience that my family is from both the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, and so I have seen it through the family sort of experience as well. And so, since we've had an introduction from Senator Mitchell about his involvement, one thing I would like to do is just get a sense from each of our panelists of how you think that Senator Kennedy's personal relationship made a difference. And let me start with you, Congressman King, because I know that you've had a close relationship with Jerry Adams, and you have known how Senator Kennedy helped to bring him to the United States at a critical time. Can you take us back to that and talk a little about it?
Yeah, we're talking back, that would have been in 1994, January 1994, and there had been an effort to get the visa for Jerry Adams. Certainly the president was leaning in that direction, but he really needed the imprimatur, you will, of Ted Kennedy, because that made it official. That showed that it was respected, that it was not something coming in from left field or right field. It was, and that it also, I think, impressed upon Jerry Adams and Sinn Féin and the IRA that this was for real, and that if they did break confidence, if they did violate any agreements or any understandings, that it's not just someone like me or Richard Neal saying it, it's Ted Kennedy. And that would be a name that would resonate throughout the U.S. and throughout Ireland.
And this was high risk because he was associated with the violence, and this was a move toward statesmanship for Jerry Adams and the group. How high risk was it in real time?
It was certainly very high risk. I mean, I was advocating for Adams, but I knew him, and I was willing to take that risk, but I didn't have as much to lose as Ted Kennedy. I mean, if I lost, who cares? Maybe Susan Brophy in the back, she'd care about me, but that's about it. No, I mean, seriously, I mean, this was a real risk for someone like Ted Kennedy, whose whole name and reputation was on the line.
Senator Mitchell, as you remember that sort of time when President Clinton was listening to what Senator Kennedy had to say, you were involved in all of this, and when there was that move to try to see if those who'd been associated with more of the armed struggle would be moving, and if there would be a receptive audience here in the United States. What's your sense of how critical that time was?
Well, that's the period in which Ted and Chris Dodd first approached me. That was the specific request at the time. I was then the Senate Majority Leader. I really didn't know a great deal about the subject. I'd had, I think, a general knowledge of it. But Ted spent a lot of time with me, in his words, educating me about the issue, as he did on many others. And after some considerable period of review through my staff and others, I made the decision to join in the signing of a letter that was sent to the President by members of Congress. So that really was my baptism into the issue. And it was, as Peter said, it was a risky thing. Nobody knew for sure what would happen. There was very determined opposition to it within the U.S. government, within the State Department, the British government, and many others. So it was not an open and shut case. And I think Peter and Richie probably would agree, and Neil and Nancy as well, that had not Ted been the principal advocate, it likely would not have occurred. I think that's probably the case, although President Clinton had made an issue of this way back in the campaign 2 or 3 years earlier. But nonetheless, I think that Ted's very strong weighing in and getting others like myself and Chris and Pat and a lot of congressmen to do it probably was the decisive factor.
And Congressman Neal, can you recall for us what it was like in terms of some of the torn allegiances that some lawmakers and people in government felt? Because Britain is the first among equals for allies to the United States, and there was this push to try to recognize what was happening in Ireland and open a new door. How hard was that at the time?
Well, I think that Teddy was very helpful. The entire Massachusetts congressional delegation signed the letter. I defended President Clinton on Newsnight. That would be the equivalent of a late-night talk show here in America. And we decided to stand shoulder to shoulder on it. But there was also a very important meeting that I think bears noting, and that was Tony Lake had ventured some, I think, effort on our part. And not much had really happened after Bill Clinton got elected. And there was a period for about a year where things languished. And Lake agreed to come up to meet with about 40 of us on Capitol Hill, and it did not go well. It ended up with recrimination. You were there. It was a pretty bad meeting.
It was ugly. What were the issues?
That he had not moved as quickly as he said he would on the issue, and to the special relationship, and the State Department pushed back hard on this. And I think one of the things that we can all take some credit for that are sitting on the stage here, that we stood up to our own State Department, including Bill Clinton and Teddy Kennedy. I mean, the State Department was deaf on this issue. They just thought that they made the argument, as the British did, that it was a matter that was, quote, internal to the United Kingdom. And we took the position that they gave us plenty of advice on international issues through Vietnam and others, and that we should be able to express the will of many of the constituents we had. So you could see the momentum begin to move, and I will tell you, Nancy will confirm this, when Lake left the room that day, he said, and this is really incredible, he said, "I promise you this, I will elevate this issue to the status of the Middle East in the White House." And we were stunned. But that's how bad the meeting went. And
nobody believed him.
And nobody believed him. And the next thing I know, we're on a speed course. And I think that, you know, for me, it starts with Bobby Sands. So there was a lot of legacy in my constituency. And I think the other point that I heard Senator Mitchell say that was very important is we have to continue to nurture this. It's not over. I mean, morning headlines and evening newscasts still report, you know, periodic violence. And while we have this great achievement that we can all, I think, take the necessary bow on, not to miss the point that we've decommissioned the guns and now it's time to decommission the hearts.
And Ambassador Soderberg, you were in the room so many times when there were long, difficult roadblocks, and you couldn't necessarily see around the corner as to how quickly this would all unfold. What are some of your memories about what was happening that was not known to the public, that you had that insight in your relationship with Senator Kennedy and this whole process?
Well, I had the honor and privilege of being the Irish person for Senator Kennedy for 6 years, which meant the entire island took his Mille Cade Falte, everyone's welcome, on his front door, literally, and I'd met every politician that had come through. And first and foremost, John Hume, who formed a bond with Senator Kennedy in the 70s when the Troubles started. And that was a lifelong friendship. They shared a good joke. Everything you said about, you know, the joke telling back and forth, they just bonded. And John Hume developed with Senator Kennedy and others a counterpart to the caucus in the House that was more aligned with Sinn Féin and the IRA, and this was a Friends of Ireland that would put out a statement every year pushing peace. And so he had a long history of doing this. So every year I wrote that statement and got to know everyone in the committee. And it was completely.
Oh, you're the one that wrote those statements.
We'd look at yours and we'd have another one. But unbeknownst to me, I found myself in the White House considered the Irish expert because I had worked for Ted Kennedy. And everybody looked at Ted Kennedy as the bellwether on which way to go. And Bill Clinton did promise Jerry Adams a visa during the campaign. It was actually before I got on the campaign, or I probably would have tried to throw my body in front of it. But the request came right away, and we just said no, and nobody cared about it. And that's partly why the House was so angry, because they didn't believe us. We were accused of lying, and it was a very tense meeting. But then what shifted the ground was John Hume coming to the White House in the fall, saying, there is something happening with the IRA. There is serious, and we were hearing it from Peter King, and not just Congressman Neal, but Bruce Morrison, and everyone was saying there was a week-long ceasefire, and everyone was saying it's really changing. I have to say, the CIA, the FBI, the British government, the Justice Department, the State Department said, no, nothing's changing. I kept asking, and the only ones who knew what was going on were the people on the Hill who had those contacts, and John Hume finally said, yes, I think you should do it. The joint declaration that was put forward by the British and the Irish government was really the linchpin, because it gave a political way for the IRA to achieve its political goals, and that was the fundamental change. And really what altered the White House, it was Al Gore, George Stephanopoulos. Susan Brophy's here, she can testify this too. I mean, the White House wanted to do this, and Clinton was saying, find me a way to do it. But until Ted Kennedy came over, and he was very much guided by John Hume and all, it really was a non-starter. And so I think had he not built that cover for the president to go ahead and reach out, and ultimately the logic that convinced the president to do it was if he put his political neck on the line, we could either find out whether Jerry Adams was serious or not. If he were serious, great, we get a ceasefire. If he's not, then we could use our political clout to go back to the Irish American community and say, see, he's a fraud and he's not going to do it. So, and that was Ted Kennedy's logic in the letter and in doing it. And I remember when that letter showed up, and it was an enormous, long list, and that is really, I think, what changed it. And it gave the president, who was a new president, the guts to stand up to his entire government, which Ted Kennedy had no problem doing. And so that was definitely the muse that got everything moving.
And now, when you look back on how the public was coming along during this time, was there a real reluctance to believe that peace was possible? Was there a sense of fear that the negotiations and the efforts were somehow going to be undermined?
I'd just like to talk briefly about the moment when Ted Kennedy saved the peace process, and only Ted Kennedy. And that was in 1996 when the IRA ceasefire broke down.
Right.
Right at that moment, this peace process wavered like I never believe it wavered again. Because I got very angry calls from Nancy Soderberg, from Senator Kennedy, from John Bruton, the Prime Minister of Ireland, saying, what is going on? What has happened? Are the IRA back in business? Is this the end of everything? And that was a very profound moment. And I knew, exactly as Nancy says, that if we could keep Kennedy, we could keep Clinton. And I remember having a very long discussion with Jerry Adams that day and saying, Jerry, you just simply have to tell me the truth. Can you get this ceasefire back? And the one thing about Jerry Adams, I think Nancy would agree with this, and certainly Peter would, I think George and Richie, when he told you something, it was the truth. It was absolutely the truth. And he said, yes, I can get this ceasefire back. And he explained to me exactly what had happened. And I remember calling back Nancy and calling back Senator Kennedy and saying, it's going to be okay. They are going to get the ceasefire back. And thankfully, I think it was Senator Kennedy had said, you know, because everybody was running for the exit at that stage. People were saying, Daniel Patrick Moynihan said, we told you so, and, you know, have we been had? And all these other people piling on saying, see, we told you, they're a bunch of terrorists, they never do anything. And yet Teddy, in the midst of that, a man with a terrific, terrible history of assassination and killing in his own family, saw around the corner far enough that he said, no, I trust these guys, I think they can do it. So to me, that was the most profound moment that I saw Senator Kennedy save the peace process, undoubtedly on his own.
Teddy Kennedy actually welcomed Jerry Adams at Logan Airport. He met him.
That's right.
He met him at the airport, and Adams came to Springfield that night for a big rally. But Teddy led the rally in Boston and greeted him with Bill Bulger. They were waiting for him at the airport, and by now the cameras are really focused on this, and by the time you move through central and western Massachusetts, and the cameras were everywhere. And I thought that by greeting him, we did some symbolic things that were very important. You can't just say we're going to sign a letter. We're going to stand up with you in public, and that way you hold people to the agreements.
I think there was a view from Kennedy that, this is probably sacrilegious, Hume had missed some opportunities in the 80s and 70s. I certainly think so. I think the Irish government was very remiss in the cases of the Birmingham 6 and the Guildford 4, which were huge human rights abuses, that for some reason the Irish government at the time, led by Gareth Fitzgerald and John Hume, told the Friends of Ireland Congress, do not do not compete on this issue. Do not say that this is a travesty, a terrible miscarriage. And the Irish Americans got very, very upset about that. I think Pete would tell you about that as much as anyone, and Richie, because it was obvious from the community that issues like which would have helped enormously with the community and stopped the radicalisation in the North and in Irish America, if we had tackled issues like Birmingham 6, Guildford 4, and other abuses by the British, even inquiries into Bloody Sunday. But there was a certain view at that point that it had to be the Irish and British government against Irish America.
Although Ted Kennedy didn't listen to that. He pushed very hard for the Guildford 4 and the Birmingham 6.
It didn't come across like that, Nancy. It really didn't. I hate to tell you that, but it didn't come across other than the fact that, there was an Irish America that was in competition with the Irish government, John Hume, and the British government. Whereas, in fact, I always believed that Irish America and the Irish government together, which eventually happened, thanks to Albert Reynolds, made a huge difference.
Yeah, they got out.
Yeah.
Also, to give Bill Clinton credit, I was president with you, Neil, back in 1992, and I snuck in as a Republican in the back door when Bill Clinton was meeting with the Democrats before the primary.
You've been doing that your whole career.
And that's when he said that he realized that with the fall of the Berlin Wall, that the old distinctions or the old rivalries and alliances didn't mean that much. And this was a unique opportunity for the U.S. to be an honest broker between the British and the Irish. And he saw that, and that's when he said he gave Adams the visa. And like all of us, he didn't know if he really believed it or not, but on the other hand, he did show more than just, I'm for the Irish. He did specifically say, with the change in the international atmosphere, that he thought this was a unique opportunity, and it would give other governments a cover to basically blame it on the U.S. than they have to negotiate.
I think it would be great to get Nancy's reaction to what Clinton now himself says. I remember that dinner we were at, George, before Christmas, and he said, he was quite coy, but he said, look, it was all fun and games, and I said I'll get them a visa. And then he said, I started to get really serious about it in spite of myself. That the first thing was just a political promise in a very busy campaign with an ethnic group that he was interested in. But once he actually waded into it, he actually found...
Well, I mean, the fact that all these promises occurred right before the New York primary was not a minor issue. But he actually really...
Purely coincidence.
But he actually really did believe it. I've actually watched him, he wanted to do it. And Susan can testify this, Brophy, he wanted to do this and actually believed that it was the right thing. And he'd been at Oxford when the Troubles began, and he really felt that they could play a role. One other comment, I wanted to just give a shout out to Senator Kennedy's appointment of his sister Jean as ambassador to Ireland. She was the only person in the entire U.S. government who didn't agree with their government. She stood up, people quit over it. She sent these messages back, and she was working the phones just like he was. And she was not an insignificant player in this at all. And because he had gotten her appointed that job, that was.
And nobody was more abused by the State Department when she was ambassador. They checked everything on her expense account, the furniture, everything. They went out of their way to harass her and drive her crazy.
Yeah.
And it seems the more they harassed her, the more she loved it. So it really, she just got.
The other break that we caught in this that was simultaneous with the point that Nancy made, and it's always underreported, the British decision to search Bill Clinton's passport files just before the election was a huge moment, because all of a sudden he started to think, well, maybe there's another side to the argument that we were all making. And, but you needed people inside of the White House that had some ability to acquaint him with the fact that this is worth doing. And Teddy was terrific, and our people that are now long gone from Congress, I think Peter and I are the last two in the House, but...
Ben Gilman?
He's still wearing his green tie.
Well, I've grown over...
I did that for you, Nancy. There you go.
Senator Mitchell, one of the outcomes of the Good Friday Agreement is that both points of view are viewed as legitimate. Those in Ireland who wanted to remain a part of the United Kingdom and those who wanted a republic. How important was that, not only at the time, but for a more enduring success of this sort of an agreement?
It's quite clear that there could not have been an agreement absent a recognition of the validity of both points of view and the opportunity and appropriateness of each side continuing to advocate their point of view. the central issue was the mechanism by which they would do the advocacy. And it was one of perhaps half a dozen crucial elements to the agreement. There were several others without which couldn't have been agreement. I just want to add a comment to what's been said about President Clinton's commitment. I was not there early in the process. As I said in my remarks, I really didn't have any great deal of knowledge about the subject. But when President Clinton asked me to go to Northern Ireland, Nancy was very instrumental in that in the White House at the time. He said to me, he said, "I'm really serious about this." He said, "The reason I'm asking you to do this is you're the retiring Senate Majority Leader. And if you go at my request and as my representative, it will convey a signal of how much I'm interested." And he was deeply interested. 2 years later, in the crucial period that Richie referred to, in September of 1996, during the presidential campaign, the president called me and asked me if I would return to the U.S. To play the role of Bob Dole in the debate preparation in the presidential campaign, because I served 6 years with Dole as majority and minority leader. I knew him very well. He remains to this day an extremely close friend. And I agreed, and the first debate was in Hartford, I think.
It was, I was there.
In Hartford. And the preparation was in Chappaqua, New York, not where the Clintons live, but up in the famous resort in the northwestern part of the state. And I flew from Northern Ireland back, got there the first evening, and the president asked me to have dinner with him and Mrs. Clinton, and there were a few others at the table. I was there. I tried to brief myself on the debate. The entire conversation at dinner was about Northern Ireland. The entire dinner. He spent the whole night asking questions, wanting to know about it. And I was kind of taken aback, and I remember saying to her at the end of the dinner, are you interested in the debate that's going to occur in a couple of days, and shouldn't we talk about that a little bit? And we did, and Chrissy did a good job in the debate. But and thereafter, he was deeply interested and involved, and on the final night, he stayed up all night in the White House. I'll never forget it. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. We were struggling, trying to bring it to a conclusion. I'd set a deadline at midnight. It had passed. And he called me, and I said, what are you doing? I said, "It must be the middle of the night there." He said, "Yeah, it is, but I can't sleep." He said, "I want to help." He volunteered calling people. So however his interest came about, I was not involved in that, but there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that once he became involved, he was deeply, personally interested and committed. And this was a very, very high degree of importance to him and to Mrs. Clinton as well.
Did you get the sense that President Clinton saw that if an agreement was achievable in this part of the world, that success might be transferable by example, if nothing else, to other conflicts around the world, that peace could be brokered in some way, a political resolution could be found? Did he see a broader implication, or was it really about just what was in front of you?
Yeah, he may have felt that, but that was never conveyed to me. He never cited as a reason to do this that it might be helpful elsewhere. And as it turns out, the reality is, having then done 2 tours of duty in the Middle East, is that while all of these conflicts have some similarities, they are essentially unique, each one, and each one requires a unique, very highly localized and specific to that conflict resolution. Principles and approaches can be universal, but actual solutions cannot be.
I was going to say, one aspect of the Northern Ireland talks, though, and George, I guess, was much more familiar with it, but going into those talks, Gerry Adams and John Hume had prepared their whole life for that opportunity. I don't think the Unionists ever thought they would be forced to negotiate. So basically, you were in a position where you had 2 guys who had been contemplating this, every parameter of it, for 20 years, and really nobody on the Unionist side who was really, I think, ready at that moment to talk about a political solution, because they never thought they'd have to have one.
Yeah, I think that's correct, Peter. I think it goes beyond that. I've said and written that the subplot to the negotiations themselves was the intra-unionist conflict. There was intense hostility between the DUP, headed by Dr. Paisley, a smaller party, UKUP, which was allied with them, and the Ulster Unionists, which was by then, at that time, the larger party headed by.
There were 6 or 8 parties involved at the time.
Yeah, there were actually 10 political parties, if you can imagine it, and 2 governments. It's sort of very hard thinking back.
We have trouble with
get them
2.
all to agree.
Sounds like the Republican conference.
Yeah. But
George, I'd be interested in your comment. Clinton has commented that if Adams was Arafat, there would have been peace in the Middle East. Do you think there's any semblance of truth to that?
No, I don't really. I mean, it's a great line, but I don't.
In terms of bringing his people with him, that
yeah, no, they're so different. I spent even more time with Arafat than I did with Adams. But I just want to say that Peter hit something there. To his enormous credit, John Hume created both the concept of the talks, the architecture under which the talks would be created. That was his great contribution. John wasn't a detailed guy. If you wanted to negotiate a paragraph agreement, you wouldn't ask John to negotiate it. You'd ask Seamus Malin or one of the other guys in the SDLP. But John had the conception of how to do it. And he basically, by agreeing to talk with Adams and involving, Albert Reynolds was then the Taoiseach, to form a general nationalist view. When they get into the talks, they weren't fighting each other all the time, whereas the Unionists were in constant combat. And I wrote in my book on it that I don't think we would have gotten agreement had Paisley not walked out. Remember, Jerry Adams and the Sinn Féin, because of their affiliation with IRA, were not in the talks for the first 16 months. And when they came in, all of the Unionists walked out, but Trimble and the Loyalist parties came back in. Paisley did not. And that liberated Trimble and the Unionists from a daily terrific assault that they felt internally, because the DUP was very, the struggle for control of unionism was a dominant part of the talks, whereas on the nationalist side, because of the greatness of John Hume, that did not occur. Now, SDLP historians may think that they paid a price for it, and they did, but nonetheless, they had a generally unified position. Which was
I can confirm that, and I'll tell you how. Tom Foley, who was not enthusiastic about any of this, and was really harsh with some of us in the House, we thought had taken more vigorous positions than he thought necessary. And I said, I think it's for real, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to go. And grudgingly, he okayed the money for me to go. That was the day that the Good Friday Agreement, the ceasefire in '94 was announced.
Did you know that?
I met John Hume, yes, I met John Hume. I knew it was coming. And I met John Hume, went to his home in Donegal, stayed the night, and he said, "You're going to see Adams tomorrow." He went to the phone and called Adams on the phone. So to George's point, I mean, one of the things that Hume did, he used a lot of his own political capital on this. And in the end, you know, the British government, I think it's fair to say, would always say to us, you need to prop up UUP.
Yeah.
Right? And the Irish government would say to us, you need to prop up SDLP.
Yeah.
And in the end, it's DUP and Sinn Féin. And one thing I'd like, if I could ask a question of George, because I thought it was a work of genius. The Irish government gave up Articles 2 and 3 of their constitution, which laid claim to the 6 counties in the north of Ireland. But at the same time, we got Strand 2 of the Good Friday Agreement.
That's right.
Belfast, Dublin.
Yeah.
And I think that therein lies the genius of the Good Friday Agreement, Strand 2, Belfast, Dublin.
Yeah. One of the reasons we were able to get an agreement was that there are so many issues that it was possible to devise an agreement in which you could balance off different interests. It's really very hard to solve when you have only one issue, because somebody has to win or lose, and in Northern Ireland, there's no such thing as a magnanimous winner. When you win, you poke the other guy in the eye with a stick to make sure that everybody knows who won and who lost on both sides. So you're right, Richie, there were a number of trade-offs. I just want to add the comment that I've said very nice things about John Hume, which I profoundly believe. I also think that there has not been enough recognition of the contribution and cost that was paid by David Trimble. What he did was very courageous under the circumstances. He was subjected to tremendous internal criticism, both within unionism from Dr. Paisley and the UKUP, but also within his own party, which suffered greatly as a result, as did the SDLP. But he rose to the occasion, and it ended up costing him his leadership and largely his career in Northern Ireland. And I think really the Nobel Peace Committee got it right. There would not have been a process without John Hume, and there would not have been an agreement without David Trimble.
Well, so I got to add, though, to put in a word for Gerry Adams. I remember meeting with him in 1987 down at Sevastopol Street in Belfast, and he was then talking about what he was trying to do to bring the IRA along. That was really 7 years before the visa. I mean, you're talking about guys who have been fighting for 80 years. I mean, you go from one to the other, and they felt they've been betrayed time after time by their political leaders. And Gerry saw himself maybe being the next Michael Collins. I mean, the guy who'd go out there and get shot himself. So it took a lot of guts on his part. And I would say it really wasn't until right up to 93, 94 that he probably had a solid majority on his side. But there were a lot of guys with guns who disagreed with him and called him a traitor.
That's right. Well, he and Martin McGuinness both were outstanding leaders within their own party and organization, and bringing along many people who did not share their view that they had gone as far as they could through military means, and that the only path forward to success was through democratic and peaceful means. Now I don't think any of them have ever or will ever admit it, but it is quite clear in retrospect, and historians I think are unanimous on this, that they could not have achieved their stated goal, which was driving the British out of Northern Ireland by force of arms. It simply was counterproductive. In fact, I mean, I've spent a lot of time in the UK, Northern Ireland. It aroused more interest in England, Scotland, and Wales than would otherwise have been the case. Sort of, well, they're not going to drive us out of there. And so they'd gone as far as they could go, and it was Gerry and Martin and their many colleagues who recognized that and said they had to make this shift, and to their credit, they negotiated very well and skillfully.
I asked Adams once whether, had Bill Clinton been in office in the 80s, could they have gotten this earlier, because Gerry had started the talks with John Hume earlier, and he says, no, we weren't ready. It took them that long before they could. His one goal was to keep the IRA from splitting. And that's kind of what happened when the ceasefire broke down, but it largely happened.
That's right.
I would just add to the questions that we keep asking Senator Mitchell, but to me, I'm very concerned about the lack of progress since the Good Friday Agreement. You still have this exact same people in the same mindset fighting about the same issues, parades in the government, and I just wonder, and this is where I think someone like a Ted Kennedy could have gone over there and pushed them a little bit harder than is being done now, because in my view they need a new generation that thinks about high-tech firms and the economy, not some of the issues that are anchoring them in the past. There are more walls than there were before. The schools are still not segregated. The police has a couple of Catholics in it. But what do you think in the mentality that, it's generational, in this case probably 2 generations, before they're going to be able to drop those anchors that are dragging them down? It's surprising to me that that mindset is still so
And we are
embedded.
running short on time, so let me jump in if I may. If you can give us sort of some summary thoughts about where we are now, and then I'd like to ask each of you, because your rich recollections really are speaking to what the value of the oral history itself is. hearing from people who were in the room, people who were part of the process, people who have personal recollections and relationships that shaped history then and will educate us for generations to come. So if we can close with some of those thoughts, Senator
Okay, no,
Mitchell, if you
we'll let
can take
them
us
go ahead
forward.
first, then I'll finish.
Very good.
Well, I think that when Tony Blair was leaving, he invited some of us to the British Embassy to say goodbye. And when he stood up, he said, I think it's fair to say that America and Great Britain have agreed on most issues through our common histories. But he said, it's also fair to say there was one issue we did not agree upon, the North of Ireland. And he said, I want to thank all of you for what you did to help bring us into the process. To have a British Prime Minister say that. Now, I always thought we caught another break, and that was because Iraq had gone so badly that he was looking for a reset for his own career, and he gets credit for that. But think of it tonight. If we were sitting here 25 years ago, there were 30,000 British soldiers in an area the size of the state of Connecticut in the north of Ireland. The watchtowers were all over the place, and there are, to Nancy's point, 30% of the police service of Northern Ireland is now Catholic, and we're headed toward 45%. So it's a huge accomplishment. So there's been these broad reforms. There are problems, there's no question about it.
But you see progress.
The progress has been enormous, and there's a government that is representative of both traditions in one community that's up and functioning and has been duly elected.
Niall, thoughts about where we are today and what you think the legacy of all of this is?
I just want to tell one funny story about Nancy Soderberg, if I can.
I don't think we have time.
The night before the Gerry Adams visa was granted by President Clinton, Nancy called me in the middle of the night and said, what has Gerry Adams got to do with the bombs in San Diego? I said, what are you talking about? He said, there have been 2 bomb scares phoned into a British store in San Diego by the IRA. And at this stage, I was extremely tired, and I thought maybe she was hallucinating as well, because the idea of the IRA carrying out an attack in San Diego was so insane. But I remember saying to her, what do you need me to do? And she said, you have to get Adams to apologize for the bombs that the IRA put in San Diego. And I said, the IRA didn't put any bombs in San Diego. Obviously, it looked like a dirty trick to stop the visa going through. But I finally got Ted Kennedy, the first time I ever spoke directly to him, actually. And he said, you tell Adams to apologize for this, and I'll guarantee that visa. And that's exactly what happened. So, so Gerry, I wake him up in the middle of the night and say, you've got to apologize for bombs in San Diego. And he said, does this mean I have to apologize every time an Irishman hits an Englishman?
In a pub.
As to how things are today, I agree. I mean, if you told me 25 years ago that Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness would be in power together, I would have suggested a good psychiatrist. And I think we're all too close to it in many ways because we've all played our role. And I think that the notion that it's not improving, if you look at the recent elections, there was an interesting sort of left-wing parties kind of getting support in West Belfast who weren't political in any way, in the old-fashioned way. There could be the beginning of it. And Sinn Féin, I think, are obviously very focused on the South as well because they're the 3rd largest party there. So I think it'll take another generation. I think peace comes dropping slow, as Yates said. I think it really does. Yeah.
Very quickly, Neal was our interlocutor with Adams because he was on the terrorism list still. I wasn't allowed to talk.
Not me, Adams.
So, and I have to say that to the point of honesty, you know, Neal was a journalist, and I was talking through a journalist to Neal, to Adams, and never once was there any breach of confidence, and I want to thank you for that. And Adams, as frustrating as it was to get him to yes, once you got him to yes and to commit to something, he every single time delivered it. I mean, it's a very impressive code of honor. And I think the peace is irreversible, there's no doubt about that. And there were 200 or 300 people dying a year in that conflict. So they don't know who they are, but they're walking around alive, and that's a huge thing. And I think the Good Friday Agreement would never have happened without your angel-like patience. wit and humor and wisdom and perseverance. And maybe it's I hadn't heard the brother story before, but maybe you're going to prove them that you're going to get it. I would just like to close with a shout out to the oral history and what Vicky's putting together. I have been to the Institute. I was there for the opening. It is unbelievable. Please go if you can ever. It's just, it's just a unique, I've read through a lot of the oral histories that are already up online for this. If you're here, and you're obviously, if you're here, you're interested in this, take a look at them. One person who should be here is Carrie Parker, who's very ill, but Carrie was Senator Kennedy's muse through his entire career in the Senate, or I think almost all of it. And really, his oral history of this is, I would commend to all of you, because he was really the muse behind so much of not just the Irish process, but whatever he did. But thank you to Vicky for pulling the event tonight together, but also for what you're doing to preserve the legacy, not just of your husband, but also of the Senate. And he was there through it all, and it's a better place for it, so thank you.
Congressman King, do you want to have a closing thought?
Yeah, I would just say there's really no comparison between today and 25 years ago. If you went to Belfast during the 1980s, there's only certain streets you could walk down, certain taxi cabs you could take. If you wanted to go to a Unionist or Protestant section, you had to take a certain taxi cab. Same on the Catholic or Nationalist side. There were no restaurants or bars in downtown Belfast. People didn't go shopping downtown Belfast. Today, probably the people who suffer the most are the pub owners in the Nationalist Catholic areas, because it used to be people don't know other bars to go to, but the ones in there, now they go into town and they can go to restaurants. I remember Jerry Adams saying once that his dream in life was to be able to sit in a restaurant with his son in Belfast without worrying about getting shot. So I mean, the whole world has changed. And I just take it anecdotally. Every year since I've been in Congress, we have college students intern in my office from Northern Ireland. And the first 10 years from 92, let's say 2001, 2002, all these kids knew about was they could tell you every battle, everyone that was shot, everyone that was killed, everyone that went to jail. And they, again, both sides I would have in. Now, it's like us talking about the American Revolution or the Civil War. It's ancient history. So I think that is a generational change. They just, this is something their grandparents taught them. That's the way they look at it, not realizing it was only 18 years ago that we had the Good Friday Agreement. By the way, one thing also we could take from what George said tonight, the Good Friday Agreement should have been the Holy Thursday Agreement, but the Irish didn't get there in time. It went after midnight, so that was... Anyway, also, let me just say that the U.S. was the guarantor of the peace talks, but really Ted Kennedy's reputation and name was the guarantor in that, I can tell you that Jerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, people, especially people on the Republican side, they knew if they lost Ted Kennedy that they lost the U.S.
It was over.
So really just having Ted there as the president really meant so much. So Vicki, thank you.
And Senator Mitchell, a closing thought from you, sir?
Yeah. Before I went to Northern Ireland, I spent a good bit of time in the Balkans in the connection with the conflict there. And I recall traveling to a small town along the border of Bosnia and Croatia. It had been about 50-50 Serb and Croat when the actual war began. The Serbs gained the upper advantage, took control of the town, and burned down every building in the town that was owned by a Croat. 18 months later, the tide of war changed and the reverse occurred. When I went there, literally every building had been destroyed, and I talked with a young mayor, and a very nice and wise man, and I asked him, how long do you think it will be before the Serbs and Croats will be able to live in this town side by side in peace again? And he said, we will repair our buildings long before we repair our souls. That will take generations. And the reality is, in all human conflict, the most important and yet most difficult task is to change what's in people's minds and hearts. I think it will take generations, and I think it will be when all of those who lived in, during, or at the time of the conflict have passed, and when for all living in Northern Ireland, it is a matter of history. They take history very seriously there, more than we do, but nonetheless, if you suffered through the conflict, if you endured the conflict, you can't let go of things as you can when it's a memory, not a real-life event. So I don't think we should be too harsh on them. In fact, I go to Northern Ireland a lot, and invariably the reporters ask me, oh, isn't it terrible the way things are here, all this fighting and fuming and so forth? And I say, why don't you travel to the U.S. and turn on the TV if you want to see real political and conflict. We should not hold the people of Northern Ireland to a standard higher than we would apply to ourselves or to other societies. They are tremendously energetic, productive, strong, and effective people. They will build a truly successful society and overcome all of the difficult heritage of the past. It'll take a long time, but they'll get there. And I think that the numbers on both sides who are still disgruntled and want their way 100% and are willing to use violence to get there are decreasing in number. I think they're vanishingly small, and we can't let them take control of the agenda that the vast majority of people there support: peace, progress, prosperity for all.
Well, I'm sure you will join me in thanking this incredible panel for sharing their insights. History is written in headlines and history books, but you see that their personal experiences, their personal relationships, and their keen memories of this are part of what makes it so rich, and what a great experience. And again, it's reflected very much in the oral history that is a part of the EMK Institute. And please take a look at that. You'll learn so much more, and you brought it to life tonight. Thank you all so very much. Appreciate it. Thank you, Vicki.
Thank you all very much, Kelly, and thank you as well for an excellent job. Now, we promised the Congressman they might have some closing remarks, but I'm feeling like you've just made those remarks. Thank you so much.
We've heard enough from Neil tonight.
I think that our next topic that we've chosen is related to a comment that Senator Mitchell made. The topic is going to be campaigns, past and present. And that is going to be in Boston in late September, early October. So we should have a lot that we can talk about then. Thank you all. Please join us for a reception in the adjoining room.